We're so excited today to welcome journalist Mason Adams. Formerly of Goats, Roller Derby, Roanoke Times, and Condors, he's now an independent mountain journalist and co-host of Inside Appalachia, West Virginia Public Broadcasting's storytelling podcast that explores Appalachian economy, food, music, and culture. He's also a longtime Roanoke writer, having covered a variety of features for us. Most recently, an in-depth look at the marijuana movement in Virginia back in our May-June 2022 issue, as well as the 35th anniversary of Falwell v. Flint in Roanoke, as well as incredible profiles on Onsley Ware, a trailblazing politician and Roanoke's first black judge, and Mayor Sherman Lee, a.k.a. the Shermanator, all of which you can read online at theroanoker.com. Hi, Mason. Thanks so much for coming on our show today.
Hey, thanks for having me, Liz.
Yeah, we're excited to chat with a feature that you did in our Jan-Feb issue. And real quick, I have to give a shout out because this piece on the iconic Roanoke Skyline in the issue you're going to see is a shout out to one of my favorite people in the whole world, Anna Morales. She's actually our art director who made all of these custom illustrations seen in the piece. She's incredibly talented, and it's so exciting to see her work come to life on the pages.
Yeah, it was part of my thinking when I came to you with that pitch was it would need a really strong visual component, and I feel like Anna knocked it out of the park.
Absolutely. Yeah. So thank you. So, you actually came to us about this piece several months ago, and I was curious about, first of all, what was it about the Skyline that you wanted to learn about or share with our readers?
I think about my stories for the Roanoker tend to be sort of like pop mythology, I think a lot, which is not like stories that are false, like when we think about myths, but more like how we take events, people, places, and sort of build them into our collective identity, our collective sort of popular imagination. And so I was actually doing a lot of driving back and forth this last year, especially on 581 in Roanoke. I was coming out of Floyd and going over to Bonsack, so that stretch between Colonial and Orange. I was driving back and forth, each direction, and just seeing the skyline. And I'm middle-aged now, and I have these memories, and as a former Roanoke Times reporter, I covered when the skyline started changing again. And one of the big overarching stories, I think, was how Roanoke's identity was changing. When I first came to work at the paper in 2003, there was this idea that I think it was that the Washington Post called us a blue-collar gritty blue collar hub or something like that. And
which makes me raise an eyebrow now.
It's stuck in people's craw. And but like a lot of Roanokers like had this image of like, oh, this place sucks. And I'm familiar with that. I grew up in about an hour north of Roanoke. But then when I was there covering City Hall, that was the era when Ed Walker first started redeveloping his apartment buildings in downtown. And you saw others jump in, Bill Chapman, Lucas Thornton, the Virginia Tech Carrillion School was coming together, all these kind of big changes. And so I feel like that the skyline started moving and changing. And Dennis Cronk, the commercial realtor, had said that to me when I was a Roanoke Times reporter about how the city skyline had been pretty static for a while at this point in the early 2000s. But we were seeing the redevelopment of these buildings happen. The Patrick Henry, the Hieronymus building hadn't happened, but it was on the horizon. He said, eventually you're going to start seeing new construction. And sure enough, not much long later, Lucas Thornton put up Gramercy Row, and which is very prominent and was part of that. Part of what the changes I could see when I was driving by on 581. Similarly, south of the South Jefferson area with that VTC, Virginia Tech Carrillion School of Medicine, the Research Institute, the bridges, and I was just like, wow, downtown is changing. And I remember actually when I was the City Hall reporter, they had the City Council had officially extended the downtown area managed by Downtown Roanoke Incorporated to incorporate that Riverside area around Roanoke Memorial Hospital. And I just, like, every time I drove by, I would look at that and think about it and think about how those buildings, like, and the landscape around us shapes our conception of who we are.
Right. It's kind of amazing just to think, I've been here for about 12 or 13 years now, and just how far it's come since then. I mean, it really is amazing. I actually, my college roommate is from Roanoke, and so I remember visiting her during our freshman year, so roughly 2004. That's how old I am now. But one of the interesting things was the Taubman was being built, and it wasn't complete. It was still very much, under, building. But it was kind of incredible to hear my friend's feedback that the community was giving very diverse opinions on that particular building.
What was your friend's feedback?
She loved it. She's an art major. teenager, so she thought it was great, and I do too. I think it's very iconic to me as part of our skyline. I think that piece of modern, architecture in the middle of everything else is just a really beautiful way to kind of greet the future of Roanoke.
Yeah, in some ways, I think the Taubman is sort of the linchpin of this piece because you're right. It was a new addition to the skyline. It was right close to the Dr. Pepper sign and the H&C Coffee sign, which are also iconic parts of that skyline. And people kind of flipped out when the design first came out, and even when the construction of it went up. But I feel like the consensus has changed. And I don't know if it's just all the new people coming in that think it's better or that like it, or folks have gotten used to it now.
I was thinking about, and it's not just about the Taubman from a distance, right? Because I love to go to that top floor and stand on the balcony, and you feel like you're right there on the Dr. Pepper sign, right? You're almost the superheroes that were up there for a long time.
Yeah, and as I got into this story and started working with Anna on it, it shaped my view of the downtown a bit. When I was a city hall reporter, it was important to me and get out and run. I tried to run in every neighborhood, if not every street, because I think one of the things that afflicts Roanoke is it's anywhere. People get stuck in their neighborhoods and they kind of start to develop stereotypes about other parts of town. So as a reporter covering the area, it was important to me to put myself in these places, but not just in my car on the ground. So that's what I did in reporting this. I spent time running a lot through downtown, going up Jefferson, and just slicing and dicing through different ways. And it's I hadn't been through the downtown that much recently since I've been in Floyd, but it affected my writing. And Anna was just a great part of this because as she and I talked back and forth, we decided that the story should follow the illustrations. And I wanted to try to orient it geographically in some way. So I was like, well, let's go north to south. You start and you're there at the cathedral. I mean, even before that, you could say down, the Civic Center, I feel like is part of that skyline to some degree, or even Round Hill. But when you get to downtown, it gets more dense. And so I wrote the story to kind of walk us through north to south to reflect those illustrations, which I think she did a beautiful job.
Oh, they're amazing. And it's funny because I remember when we first sat down, you probably had a different idea in mind, right? And then once we kind of say, here's what we can do, here's within our capabilities, and illustrations are a slam dunk for Anna, obviously, to line them up with what you were kind of piecing together was, I don't know, it's just really great to see on the page and on the web, and use those everywhere we can.
Thank you. And I do think you're at a point, the last thing I would like to say about the Taubman is I think that point about perspectives is something I really tried to embed in this story. I talked about driving by in 581, but when I talked to Lucas Thornton, he says he tries to imagine it from the person coming in town the first time, getting off of Amtrak, and what does the city look like to them? It also made me think about, I can remember, my own personal memory informs this, right? Because I remember those new parts, the bridges going up, Gramercy Row going up, but I cannot for the life of me envision what it was like before urban renewal, before 581. And I know in my mind kind of what it generally, but I just don't have the vision to look at that.
Right. It's hard to remember.
But other people like Nancy Agee, the Carillion CEO, talked about one of her memories was living with their grandmother in the neighborhood next to Towers when it was just a big field, and she thought it was the hugest mall. And I have a similar experience. I remember going to Crossroads, which is now not so much a mall anymore, but I used to go to the arcade there. And then talking to people like Lucas Thornton, it feels like they can see into the future. They can look down Jefferson between Community Hospital and 581 and see all those empty parking lots. Or, they're not always empty. There's cars in them, but they're parking lots. And you can see garages and new buildings coming up. And, Lucas made a great remark that I thought it demonstrated that when he was talking about Gramercy Row and he was talking about some people's negative reaction to it. But he says when the maples grow to full size and come in, it's going to be a completely different experience.
He really did see the future.
Yeah, right? And when he's still looking 10 years down with what the maples are going to look like in 30 years. You're right. And it just boggles my mind. Some people's visions are flawed sometimes and they think something's going to happen and it doesn't work out. There's definitely been plenty of failed developments. But man, this wave of developers we have now developing Roanoke just is really transforming the city.
Absolutely.
And I think for folks who are moving here now, this is just the way it's always been.
Right.
And what's it going to be like 30 years in the future? That is fascinating to me. And I tried to turn that back to the reader at the end. Nancy Agee talked about when Carilion built the South Pavilion at Roanoke Memorial, they tried to use a lot of glass and have a green tint so it fits in with Mill Mountain, which was interesting, but more importantly, to have it reflect the community, because you do have the railroad, the river, and 581 are all right there, which a wise editor once told me, if you want to get around Roanoke, you figure out where the crossings for those three places are, and you can get anywhere quick snap. But they're all right there, and she talked about the city will be able to see itself reflected back.
I think that's really interesting, because you're not just throwing up a building and walking away from it. You're really considering the impact it's going to have on the people that live and work there. And I think that's a really nice thing to just think about from the contractor's perspective and from the builder's perspective, because I don't think we as citizens kind of think about that, that sort of thoughtfulness is put into that. It's really interesting.
Yeah. And my favorite part of this, and in fact, it factors into my running too. I was running up Mill Mountain just days before the deadline on this and thinking about how I was going to close the story. And like we're a city that has a mountain in its skyline within the city limits, and you can look down on that skyline. And I remember going up there and seeing all these people gathered at the overlook looking down. And I just, I kind of wondered what each of them thinks, what they were looking at, what their perspective is.
Right. And you mentioned the star. We got to talk about the star for a minute, because that is something that I'm from Danville, so right down the road, not terribly far, but far enough that Roanoke was the big city for me growing up. So to have the star, that's an incredibly iconic piece of our skyline. It's just absolutely a piece of our culture now. I can't imagine not having it. And of course, the fact is, when you drive in from 580, when you see that star, that's when you know you're home.
What's fast? One of the people I talked to for the story, I'm not going to say whether they were quoted or not or who they were, but asked about the difference between iconography and kitsch. Because if you tried to put up a giant neon star on a mountain today, I don't think it would work. Mm-hmm. I don't think it'd work. But it's such a crucial piece of Roanoke's identity now. And people who probably would oppose it now would love it, though, now that it's there. I'm not saying that justifies us doing it, but it is interesting, that relationship.
Yeah. I just can't imagine not seeing that star on, whenever I drive into town.
Right. I remember Martin Clark in one of his novels, he talks about someone getting out of jail and in one of the few spots, the front of the jail is one of the few spots where you can't see that star.
Really?
In Roanoke. I mean, there's other places where the buildings are, but that is a place that's shielded where you can't just look up and automatically see it.
Interesting. So. Well, speaking of interesting, in all your research and people that you were talking to, what was, one of the most interesting things you learned writing this story?
Allison Blanton is an architect here in Roanoke, and she said some really cool things that got me thinking, got my gears going about how, the different parts of the city and when they were built reflect sort of the story of downtown. Like a lot of the earliest buildings were 2 and 3 floors, because if you needed to take a meeting or come to, there weren't such things as, telephones really hadn't been fully popularized yet. I don't know if that's true or not technically, but there weren't elevators. So if you wanted to talk to someone on the ground floor, you didn't want to be 8 or 10 floors up and having to walk all the stairs. Whereas, that's changed though since then. But just, kind of some of the different things that I really learned were exactly when stuff was built, looking at some of these maps and realizing St. Andrew's Cathedral and the Hotel Roanoke were built pretty close to each other. But look how different that architecture is.
Yeah, really different.
From each other. And so, just thinking about that was interesting to me, and sort of thinking about the way that if you know how to read the language, I guess if you're an architect, you know how to read the language, you can see the stories of the city and how it was built. And that's kind of interesting to me.
Cool. Well, out of all the buildings in the skyline that we're talking about, what's one of your favorites?
I like Center in the Square, partly because I have kids, and we like going to the museums. We like going to the Pinball Museum. We like going to the Starcade. And the other museums as well. The African-American Museum's awesome. And we always like going up to that roof, even if we're not doing the Butterfly Garden, just to go up there and take a look. It's sort of like the inverse of Mill Mountain in some ways.
Yeah, because you're in the city as opposed to looking over it.
But I don't know. There's so many other buildings I like, though. Like I have personal history, like with some of the warehouses on Albemarle now. I remember there was a series of shows there before the fire marshal shut them down, and I've only booked a couple of shows ever, but I booked a Roanoke Power Violence punk band, a hip hop act, a pop punk band, and an 8-bit electronic act on the same bill, and it was awesome. And then it got shut down not too later. But I have like memories like that embedded, or when the tie-dye guy had moved out of Towers, but it was in the warehouse there by Elm Avenue. So I don't know. That's a lot of those are tied up for me as well.
Yeah, I even remember as a teenager driving up, we'd come to Salem Civic Center for the bands who would come up and play, and so you always drive by the Wells Fargo Tower, and seeing that gold building glinting in the sunlight as you pass by was always something that I can recall like it was yesterday, even though it was 20 years ago.
When I first moved back to Roanoke in 2003, I'm not from Roanoke originally, I'm from Clifton Forge, but I'd been in North Carolina and was doing a zine called There's Nothing to Do Here. And our third issue was the first one entirely produced in Roanoke. And our cover was by a photographer named Kent Moore, who also documented the punk scene. And it was that top being placed on Wells Fargo Tower, I think, or at least it was during the construction. I shouldn't have claimed the top was being placed on it. That may be wrong, but it was a photo of that construction. And again, here's this punk photographer that took that photo when it was happening, and for him, he can remember that. But I can vaguely remember before, but it's been there since I moved back to Roanoke in 2003. So again, it's been part of the landscape for me.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned Center in the Square with your kids, but other things that you love to do around the region while we have you here.
I love this area. I'm a outdoor recreationalist. I like to trail run. I like to mountain bike. I love Carvin's Cove. The Appalachian Trail's awesome. I live right off the Blue Ridge Parkway up in Floyd, so of course I love trekking all along the Blue Ridge Parkway. Yeah, and also the Greenway, which is not part of the skyline, but it's definitely part of the landscape.
It's iconic to me. So I'm there all the time.
I still like running through different neighborhoods in Roanoke, but it's cool. I like doing loops off of that Greenway and like where you dip in a little bit and are on that because you get like a cool cross section of people on there as well.
Yeah,
we encounter them more on foot than you do necessarily in the neighborhoods themselves.
Yeah, we stumbled upon Norwich one weekend just because we were walking that direction. And I mean, we're in Wasena. We're not that far, but we just never went over there. Next thing you know, we're like, this is such a beautiful section of the Greenway. Why haven't we been over here before? So it's always exciting to discover new spots off there.
That's a cool part of town too. It's got some cool history. I just like, I don't know. The more I talk to people about Roanoke, the more revved up and cool. I don't know. I think the history of it's so cool, and I'm still going to continue doing these sort of pop mythos stories for the Roanoke, I hope.
Oh, well, we can't. Oh, man, you're not getting away that easy. We can't wait. Well, thank you so much, Mason, for being our guest on From Print to Podcast. We're so grateful for your hard work on all things local journalism. Please be sure to follow Mason on social media, including Twitter, found at Mason Adams, that's ATOMS, and read his latest feature on Roanoke's iconic skyline in our Jan-Feb issue on newsstands now, or see more at theroanoker.com.